Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today it is the 17th of September, and in today's video we're looking at a lot of interesting developments, beginning with Russian advances in the fortified post south of Novoivanivka. We'll then zoom in on the battle for Pokrovsk, with the Russian side starting to turn the tide and making some advances, incremental gains south of the city. We'll then zoom in on the battle for the Serbyansky forest and the northern flank of Siversk, followed by advances east of the Oskil River and within Kupyansk itself, along with the deployment of a new unit to hold on to the city of Kupyansk by the Ukrainian forces. So we'll finish off by then zooming in on the battle for Zaporizhia, which is within the western parts of Zaporizhia. So a lot to go through today. I've listened to your feedback and I'm going to implement those changes. A lot of them I'm going to incorporate effective immediately. Let's zoom in over here. You can see that the map is far less cluttered than before. I'll turn on and off the units, I suppose, but I can also turn on the fortifications when it's necessary. So over here, you guys can see the units involved in the Russian pushes that are occurring within Zaporizhia in this particular direction, the Yanchur River line. So we have the 37th and 57th motorized rifle brigades involved in the push to take over Novoivanivka. Currently, it is contested, with the Russians in the process of taking it over in its full extent. We can see that over the past 24 hours, the Russian side has been able to capture what amounts to 6.9 square kilometers. There's a geolocation that backs this up. So from September 17th, we have a video here of the Shadow Drone Group conducting FPV strikes onto Russian forces that are located in this major fortified outpost. And this is a part of the first line of defense meant to protect the Zaporizhia region. And so I'm going to turn on the trenches over here. You can see how this could be a major fortified outpost utilized by the Ukrainians to defend from the south, but also from the east to a certain degree, given the depth of these defenses. But due to the rapid pace of the Russian advance and the Ukrainians being thin on manpower in this region, they were unable to repel the advance. And as a result, the Russians took over a large chunk of the densest portion of the Ukrainian defenses in this region, meaning that now they're only about 3 kilometers away from the Yanchur River, and by extension, a lot of villages that are right next to it, like Novomykolaiivka and Novovasilivska. So those regions are already in danger of being targeted through direct means, direct fire control over the paved road that runs along the entire Yanchur River, putting a lot of strain onto frontline villages like Poltavka and onto the rear as well. So currently there is a concerted effort to take over Novoivanivka and then from there push northwestwards to Novohryurivka, with the intention of then establishing firing positions to overlook the Yanchur River, both in terms of positioning directly north in terms of just vertical positioning, but then also the topography is on higher elevation, of course, along these particular open fields that I'm marking with an X over here that overlook Uspenivka and the nearby river valley. So that's a part of the Russian initiative over here. At the same time, we have elements of the 394th Motor Rifle Regiment that are involved in the movement near Olhivske, and they're supported by the 69th Covering Brigade. I know they're somewhere around here. They're all on the map. At the same time, though, we have a new effort by the Russian side to push towards Kalinivske from Novomykolaiivka. So that's currently one of the main Russian objectives, to continue advancing along the second line of defense within Dnipro and Zaporizhia, especially along this particular paved road, and then from there hop from village to village, with the intention of also clearing out Berezheve, which is currently contested according to some Ukrainian sources. And so we'll keep an eye out for a Russian storming potentially of said village. Now, moving on to the situation in Pokrovsk, this is rather interesting, and I'll turn off the fortifications over here because they have a bit less utility when it comes to understanding the situation over here. So the Russian forces are beginning to take back some of the territory that the Ukrainians were able to seize during the mid to late chunk of August. So it started off in early September with the Russian side, this time with regular assault battalions, with forces that are parts of motor rifle regiments, or just any sort of linear battalion that is engaged in normal frontline duties, not talking about a DRG group that is several kilometers away from an established line of contact. So we're talking about actual mainstream Russian forces in this case, some of them being from, for instance, the 30th Brigade, but their presence has been downscaled recently. Same thing with the 35th Brigade. So we are seeing a shift over here. We're beginning to see a massive buildup, a massive accumulation of Russian forces from a large variety of locations. That would include the 51st Combined Arms Army, 68th CAA as well. 8th Combined Arms Army was sent to also boost the 1st Army Corps, or if you want to call it the 51st Combined Arms Army. They are also operating in this area to the northeast of Pokrovsk. A lot of the Marine units that have recently come in, there were released 4 or 5 of those Marine brigades, and also some VDV units that have been deployed and are amassing forces to resume really intense assaults, both directly to the south of Pokrovsk, but also in the areas to the northeast, with the intention of cutting off Mirnorod, cutting off the connectivity between Pokrovsk and Mirnorod. We can see, I've talked about this in a couple of videos now, but DRGs are making an effort to push a wedge in between Chervony Liman and Mirnorod because they sense that there is a weak point over here in the Ukrainian line. Around Rodinsk as well, the pace of the fighting has died down, but the Russians do still see that as an opportune location for attack because it really is a village on its own. And after that point, there is just a large swath of open fields that can be seized, that can be used to close down the entire salient. So the Russians really are building up a massive garrison of forces to be used to attack across a wide variety of axes, many choke points. And one of them is over here, because we have Leontivici that is being used as a corridor through which the Russian side is infiltrating into the outskirts of Pokrovsk. And now we have the consequences of that. This video over here from the Horns of Dovbush unit, a part of the 68th Yager Brigade, they conducted FPV strikes onto houses and dugouts near Jubilee Park, just south of the Pivdeny microdistrict. The Pivdeny district is generally over here. And then we have this dacha region with a couple of rural houses and a lot of agricultural gardens. So this is an area where the Russians are beginning to seep into, taking advantage of the basements in the cellars and, of course, some of the foliage. And in response, drone crews that have been well established now for months over here, engaged with DRG forces, they're now trying to repel this next wave. This is the third wave of Russian infiltrations, and this time it's being done with more mainstream forces and being done with lines of supply that are much closer together, because you're looking at it over here. The Russians have established positions along Volitsia Kievska in this entire horizontal portion of southern Pokrovsk, and it's only about 1 kilometer away from the geolocated advance. So now the supply situation has certainly improved for the frontline forces, and that's why I'm making just this modest estimate to show that the Russians do have presence in some of the fields just to the west of Shakhtarsky and Pivdeny microdistricts, and just to the south of Troyanda. It's becoming ever more clear as time goes on that this is the new route by which the Russians are going to try to infiltrate into the city, not necessarily doing so along Volitsia, Privolna over here, but instead trying to find a weak point in these rural houses and then infiltrating through the apartments into the central markets of Pokrovsk around here. So that's a part of the trend that we've been noticing recently. But again, the pace is still rather slow. The Ukrainians do have a tight-knit group of forces defending over there. I do want to zoom in, though, on Serbiansky Forest. You can see here that the Russians have captured what amounts to 4.3 square kilometers of territory. It is a significant advance because now the Ukrainians have been pushed out of the entirety of what it constitutes the Serbiansky Forest, which begins right outside of Kremina, and it spans pretty much like this. I'm doing it from memory, but it spans all the way to the border between Donetsk and Luhansk, and also hugs the southern outskirts of Dibrova and Kuzminya. So this location over here to the south of the Serbiansky Forest, I suppose the northern bank of the Donetsk River, and an area that is adjacent to a lot of small lakes and ponds, that's not officially a part of the Serbiansky Forest as defined by the Ukrainian administrators, but in effect it basically is, because it's the same body of trees altogether. And so the Ukrainians have now been pushed out of this entire forested region. They do still retain some positions located directly to the north of Dronivka, but the locations that are directly to the north of, say, Siversk, or of some of these dachas that are connected to Serbianka and this local quarry, they have been taken over by the Russian side. You can see over here that the Russians are currently in the final phases of clearing out this northern bank of this particular portion of the river, and the Ukrainians have largely either crossed over the river directly and then from there spread out to Dronivka and Siversk, or, for instance, from the 53rd Brigade and 119th TDF Brigade, they withdrew westwards to Yampil and are currently trying to stabilize the situation over there to ensure that the Russians can't establish a foothold in that village either. So that's currently their main objective. The problem is, though, that with the final vestiges of Ukrainian resistance north of the river in the process right now, they're in the process of being pushed out. Once that happens, the Russians will have a really broad front through which to cross over the river. You can see it over here. It's spanning around 7 kilometers. And so there are going to be a lot of routes through which they can cross over, get control over this paved route, and then from there push southwards into the northern outskirts of Siversk. We'll actually turn on the fortifications for a moment so you guys get an understanding of why this is important, because they're essentially bypassing the eastern defenses that were built to absorb an attack coming in from the horizontal direction, not from the northern flank that was never anticipated. And the trenches were built in such a way that easily reflects that. And so the Russians are aware of that fact. That's why the 36th Brigade, which is operating over here, or rather regiment from, I think it's the 20th Combined Arms Army over here, but I may be incorrect about that. But 36th Regiment, 37th Regiment, 31st Regiment, they are very active around here and are taking advantage of all those facts, sending in DRGs even deeper into the Ukrainian line to seep in and try to wreak havoc along the southeastern flank of Liman. This coincides with reports that the Russians are closing in on the eastern chunks of Chandri-Kholove, but that is not confirmed. But now let's move a bit to the north to look at what's going on in Kupyansk. So we have this positional advance by the Russian side, amounting to 3 square kilometers. So we're starting to see an uptick in advances by the Russians along the eastern bank of the Oska River. This is a natural consequence of the fact that the Ukrainians are pulling forces away from this semicircle along the front line, this ring of defense, to defend within the urban cluster of Kupyansk, which is currently the most pressing concern for the Ukrainians. They want to drag out the fighting over there and ensure that the Russians can't speed through the city center. As a result, the Ukrainians are spread very thin in the areas that are near Stepovo-Novosilivka, and then also to the west, near Pischane. So drone crews are doing most of the heavy lifting over here, along with some forward assault companies that may be deployed to some of the fortifications and ditches that you see over here that are currently being overrun by the Russian side. So 3 square kilometers of territory captured. This video from September 17th shows the Long Island unit. This is a part of the 43rd Mechanized Brigade. They conducted grenade drops onto tree lines and dugouts wherein you had these Russian forces present, and they're trying to get leverage in order to squeeze the Ukrainians out of some of their outstretched pockets that are currently thin, both in terms of sort of the corridor by which you can enter and exit them. They're also thin when it comes to their distance from large Ukrainian garrisons in the context of this bridgehead and salient, of course, because the main and strongest Ukrainian salients where you have the most access to supplies and resources would be along the western, or rather the eastern bank of the river over here. So around, for instance, the eastern part of Kupyansk, Kucherivka, Petropavlivka, Kurilivka, and then you have this outstretched location that is perhaps, let's measure it, 14, 15 kilometers away, where you have a small group of Ukrainian forces that are enveloped from 3 sides. So you can imagine how difficult those circumstances are and how it creates the conditions for the Russians to continue penetrating and to create further, cauldrons that the Ukrainians are forced out of at a certain point in time. And so the Russians are exploiting that weakness over here and trying to penetrate with a goal of maximizing the depth of their advances. Let's zoom in on Kupyansk. We can see over here that there are 2 vectors of attack that have continued to develop in recent days. First of all, the Spartak Stadium has been taken over by the Russian side, in addition to some nearby duplexes, private residential houses, and a couple of larger buildings, so about 10 hectares of territory captured. Then in the northwestern part of Kupyansk, about 17 hectares of territory taken over. The Russian forces over here took over the at least some parts of the rail station, especially running along the rail line, including the road of Ulitsia Sadova. They've been advancing along that road recently, and this is an area that's a bit more open in nature. There are larger gardens and backyards. It's also just 1-story houses, so it's easier for the Russians to get a foothold in them without encountering stiff Ukrainian resistance. So they're using this weak point in the Ukrainian line to eventually approach the center of the city, which would include this warehouse near the rail depot. And then from there, downtown is near where you have the city district employment center, the markets, a couple of large stores as well. So the Russians are making inroads along multiple axes. First and foremost, along the eastern bank, or rather western bank, then from the northwest where you have the rail line, and then also along the main highway pushing into downtown, all with the intention of isolating the strongest Ukrainian pockets of resistance, which would include the Citadel region, which is currently contested. You can see that I've put an X over it over there. And then also, by extension, some of the downtown areas are also rather well defended and fortified, which is why there is an attempt now to close in on it from 3 axes. At the same time, we received information that the 3rd Assault Brigade AZOV is being redeployed from the Luhansk front because it was a part, of course, of the Army Corps that was defending over here all the way from, say, Shandry-Holove, or maybe even southwards, and all the way up to Zaporizhia. So there was an entire Army Corps involved in defending over there with various responsibilities split up between the units, and at the helm was the 3rd Assault Brigade Azov, but they've been redirected from their destined defensive sector, and they've been sent in as a rapid response force to very quickly stabilize the front line and ensure that Kupyansk does not continue bleeding. The center of Kupyansk, including the Citadel region and the downtown parts of the western chunk of the city, remain under Ukrainian control. We saw the same playbook in Avdiivka when it was sent into the last moment, the 3rd Brigade, to hold off the northern flank of Avdiivka to ensure that forces were not encircled. And now, again, we're seeing history repeat. This brigade was moved from a different part of the front line to very quickly act as a stabilization measure. Now, at the same context, we used to believe that the 154th Mechanized Brigade was stationed along the western bank of the Oskar River, not fighting in Kupyansk, but still nearby. But it appears as if at least 2 battalions from the brigade were redeployed to the Novo-Ivanivka front. So they're defending perhaps along the Yanchur River, including in areas very close to Novo-Ivanivka. And you can see how I've reflected with that on the map. So the 1st Brigade, and this is called the 1st Motor Battalion, sorry, my apologies. 1st Motor Battalion of the 154th Brigade was redeployed in addition to the 3rd Mechanized Battalion. So 2 battalions were redeployed at the very least, in addition to there being 1 battalion from the 5th Assault Regiment, the 17th National Guard Brigade, the 114th Territorial Defense Battalion, and then the 3rd Battalion of the Presidential Brigade, all present over here, generally defending the Yanchur River line all the way up to perhaps Brezhove and Sosnivka. So again, they're all individual battalions. They're not really cohesive in that sense because they're not even with their brigade headquarters. And as a result, when you add them all up in terms of the manpower, it's not sufficient to hold up to such a extensive part of the front line that is so open with so many holes. So that's a part of why the Russians were even able to exploit those gaps in the first place. And to finish off with Zaporizhia, we can see over here that about 44 hectares was taken over by the Russian side. A video from the 3rd Battalion of the 33rd Assault Regiment shows FPV strikes and mortar fire onto Russian infantry as they seep into these houses and the basements really close to the main road, Pokrovsk streets. And they are trying to obviously gain a foothold and then from there expand into the other districts over here, the other roads, in a similar fashion to what they did in Plavny. And they're doing so along very narrow corridors, meaning that the FPV crews have a lot of opportunities to spot them and take them out while the attacks are in their infancy. But due to the volume of attacks and due to the fact that, again, the commitment of forces over here is not the largest in the world. Yes, there is a certain degree of deployment over here that is important, including from some specialized units like the 210th, 33rd, but only up until a certain degree. And so with a certain degree of volume, and likewise in the same fashion, there is an opportunity for the Russians to advance over here right along what used to be the eastern bank of the river. Now it's the eastern bank of the disheveled carcass of the Dnieper River. In any case, though, the advance amounts diagonally to about a 1.2 kilometer advance northwestwards as the Russians try to get control of Stepnohirsk and of southern Primorsk concurrently. So that's all for today. Thank you all for watching. Please like and subscribe if you haven't already. I'm going to continue just mentioning that in the future so the algorithm can promote me. And I appreciate also the support and feedback. I really do. I really want the channel to continue to succeed. So we're going to increase the pace of uploads and hopefully you guys enjoy this shorter formats. It's going to be shorter in the future as well, shorter than 20 minutes. So thank you all for watching and goodbye.